but I don't. Welcome to the Zachrilege cast. Dustin is back. Episode 2. I will leave last names off unless you want to put it on. That's totally up to you.
Williams is, that's out there. I did not intentionally get my last name out online with anything atheism related, but it was before I even started my podcast. I was a guest on Chariots of Iron, and they put my last name in the show notes, and it was like, well, that's out. So I've just gone with it.
And one thing that's happened with me, and you've probably had a similar situation, is like you'll have a guest reach out to you and go, hey, you mentioned where I live on the podcast. Can you get rid of that in the show notes? Or I believe it was one of your former co-hosts had an ex who was making comments on our episode where I interviewed him 5 years ago, and he was like, hey, could you take that off? And I was like, yeah, sure. Why not?
I've gotten one of those. It was a past guest who had been on, he was running for city council and just wanted me to remove his name from everything. That was easy. Not from the episode itself, just from the text. So I did. Probably didn't make any difference, but I did that.
Well, and in my case, 242 episodes in, and I'm like, somebody was like, hey, could you make an episode private because of some issue? It was like, oh, 10 views. I guess that'll YouTube will get over it. There's other commentary out there. So when we first talked, and this is crazy, this is the longest I've gone between interviews with someone. You were episode 7, and now we're 242, which means we're a little bit older. Time is relative. We've been traveling at near light speed, so it's not as long as you guys think it is. But I was drinking Duck Rabbit Brown Ale. You were drinking Deschutes Black Butte. And this episode, I'm drinking a local beer from Monday night called Bourbon Barrel Aged Drafty Kilt, which is a bourbon barrel aged Scotch ale. I know you are taking care of it. Irish Death. Now, Paul Sading, episode number 2 that I had on, he always made a big deal about that. And that was a beer I always wanted to try just because he was always talking about it. And it was like a local, I don't even know, what's the style? What was that?
It is a smooth dark ale. It is
not a beer referred to itself as smooth, but I like that.
It's not a porter. It's not a stout, but it's kind of like a porter or stout. But it's a smooth dark ale and 7.8% alcohol. And I have found that if I have more than 3 in one night, and it's not about the alcohol content, I am going to have a really shitty day the next day. It's weird. It's different than just a hangover. It's something in this beer. Yeah, it's weird.
Well, I wanted to ask, since we talked about this the last time we chatted, are the end times near?
Oh my God. And foul language is okay on the show, right?
Oh yeah.
Okay, good.
It sure fucking is.
The end times have been near since, depending on who you ask, since about 2,500 years ago. And I'm sure you could find somebody 10,000 years ago who would have said the end is near. So yes, we are in the end times. We have been in the end times for all of recorded history.
And yet we persist.
And yet we persist. Yes, there are wars and rumors of wars, just like there have always been. There are earthquakes and hurricanes and tornadoes, just like there always have been. There are volcanoes, just like there have always been.
Okay, this is a question. I have to go back to the beer question. Like with me, my current drinking situation is I love to kind of rotate amongst beers. So with you, are you like a beer monogamist? Like if you start on one, that's what you're going to be having the rest of the night?
I have been, for the last 3.5 months, doing kind of a low-carb diet. So I didn't have any beer for a couple of months. And this is... we're loosening up on the diet a little bit right now, and my wife picked me up some Irish Death. But Yeah, I've mostly been drinking wine and sugar-free mixed drinks lately. Very dry red wines.
Yeah, I was just checking because I've been a whole whopping 2 days without drinking, and I'm like, whoa, this is pretty strong. This isn't super strong. Like, there's one I like called Backwoods Bastard. It's a similar style, but it's like 12%. This is like 8.5, which for me is like tap water. So yeah, just checking in on that. So
yeah,
now,
one thing I have found is if you cut down on carbs, the alcohol hits harder. And the fewer carbs you're eating, the harder alcohol hits. Worse hangovers are too.
I mean, beer is not a low carb, even if you have Michelob Ultra or whatever. It's like if you're going to Michelob Ultra, you might as well have something you can actually taste.
Yeah.
Although I'm amazed at the like seltzer revolution. Like everybody, including local breweries, are making them, and it's like, wow, alcoholic seltzer, that's a thing. Okay.
Yeah. They have no flavor. I've had one, and it was unpalatable.
Well, I wanted to let's see. Let's start with show talk. Then we can kind of go into your background a little bit. So, Atheist Nomads. When we last talked, I think you were on episode 83, and you just dropped episode 394, which I saw earlier today. So have you been able to keep up like a weekly schedule for now? I mean, this will be like your 8-year anniversary, like later this year, right?
9th, actually.
Oh yeah. I keep thinking it's 2020. Can we do a mulligan for 2020? Yeah, 9 years of okay.
No, that's not why you're thinking that. We weren't weekly at the start. The first I think 67 or so episodes were every other week. And around that point switched to weekly. And in that time span, in the last year, I took 1 week off, and that was planned and announced. Other than that, I have never had a show out more than 3 days late since I think it was episode, I want to say around 30 or 40. And I'd had a death in the family for that one. So, yeah, I've been pulling keeping up with the weekly schedule all this time.
So that's like a scathing atheist kind of schedule without creating a new podcast every 2 weeks like they do. So,
yeah.
I mean, they have a little bit of an expanded universe now, but it's
Scathing Atheist started 9 or 10 months after Atheist Nomads, but they started off as weekly and have always been weekly, so they have a higher episode count, even though Atheist Nomads is older.
Yeah, tell them that. Just let them know, hey, we were here first, guys. So it's our it's my territory. So have you kept the format pretty similar? Like the episodes I've listened to recently have been, there's an interview at the end. There's some kind of news. I mean, there's always news. We can actually talk about some of the ongoing news later. But is that still the format you're going for?
The format has shifted over time. Like when we switched from every other week to weekly, we had been doing 2-hour-long episodes with news and an interview, and then split those up so it was alternating weeks, episode and interview, and then mostly dropped the interviews, and so it ended up being mostly just news every week. And that's basically the way it's continued since then. New segments get added and dropped every so often, but the basic format has been pretty consistent with. I usually have conversations with somebody about current events or something else interesting. On occasion, it's just me, but most of the time there's somebody else with me.
Well, how have things gone with co-hosts? Because you had Wesley on, I had you guys separately in the top 10, and of course he's still not with the show. But how has that happened with your co-host, and who's your current co-host?
So around episode 100, my then, I think she was my fiance at that time. I think it was before we got married. She started becoming more and more regular. By about episode 120. Lauren was on most episodes, almost all episodes at that point. And then Wesley left the show at around episode 200. He missed a couple episodes right after episode 200 and then was formally gone around episode 205. Then I added in kind of a rotating list of local comedians and more public atheists locally here in Boise. And that continued until I made one of them a co-host. And then Erin stayed on for a while, and then she quit shortly before the pandemic because talking about news during the Trump era, it can be really hard on people psychologically. So she ended up having to drop out. And then since then, and with the pandemic, it's been mostly my wife Lauren and I, and occasionally we get guests or have interviews. And then on occasion, it's just me. This most recent episode, Lauren was on for half of the episode.
Well, we're technically allowed to drink at the same time, but it just felt right. I saw you going for it. I'm like, heck yeah. Yeah, my cat is meowing outside of my office. I've been away from home for 2 days. We've only been away from home since pandemic times for a 1-week vacation, and this is the first time we were gone for more than 2 days visiting family. So yeah, they're not too thrilled with that situation. So yeah, that's the meowing.
All right.
And the best part about our situation is we have transferred our love of books and cats to our niece. She is absolutely
nice.
When we saw her, she's like a year and a half old. She and I finally bonded because she wanted me to show her all the videos I had on my phone with my cats. So I finally showed her like YouTube videos of cats, and that seemed to work. So yeah, cats and books are her things. We keep bringing her more books every time, and that seems to work. But the show's going strong. The show must go on, of course. Do you have plans for like episode 400? I mean, that seems like a pretty good number.
At this point, the plans have only gotten as far as a live stream on the solstice, equinox, on the spring equinox. Because that coincidentally works out to the right time before the episode is scheduled to go out on the main podcast feed. I haven't really planned it out much past that. Episode 100 was a 100-minute live stream. Episode 200 was a 200-minute live stream. Episode 300 was a 300-minute live stream. Oh. And episode 400 will not be 400 minutes. Absolutely not.
I was like, I don't know, my liver could handle me being on for 300 minutes. So I salute you for that.
By the end of episode 300, I was completely smashed. Most of that ended up being only on the live stream, and part of that was because of how drunk I was by the end.
That's the way I like to. Yeah, that's the way I like to celebrate it. So I was curious. I mean, we did talk about this last time, but so you are like almost family royalty in a way with like the Seventh-day Adventist. Can you talk about like your family connection to that?
All right. So my maternal grandfather's male lineage going back. They became Baptists in the 1600s in Kent, England. And my great-great-great-grandfather had gotten kicked out of the Baptist church there for having 2 wives. Yep, for the crime of bigamy. And then, but he continued to sit in his same pew at that church until his son, my great-great-grandfather, and his wife, they were from competing mills, and my great-great-grandfather had apprenticed at my great-great-grandmother's father's mill, and they got married and hopped on a boat and came to the U.S. And then the rest of the family came and followed shortly after that. And then they started out in Iowa in the 1860s, and then by the 1870s were in Nebraska. And a Adventist missionary went to the town they were in and started asking around, who's the most respected man in town? And they all said John Clark. So he went to, actually they would have probably said J.R. Clark. He went by J.R. So he went to J.R. Clark's door and asked to go in and talk to him. And they sat down and talked, and then he came back and they talked more, and he came back and they talked more, and they kept talking and studying the Bible. And by the end, he baptized my great-great-grandparents. Then a few years later, my great-great-grandfather felt impressed by God to put the wealth he'd accumulated through homesteading, specifically, to the Lord's work by starting an Adventist school. But somebody had to offer him a deal to sell the farm. And then some time of weeks, months, or years later, somebody who had some land in what is now the outskirts of Battle Creek, Washington, in the Portland metro area, contacted him offering to do a land swap. And they agreed to it. So he and his wife packed up and they left Nebraska and traveled to Washington. They got there and they had 80 acres that was all wooded, and they started chopping down some of the trees and built a mill, started selling some of the lumber, built themselves a house, they built a school, they built a church, and a Adventist community started forming around this church and school. Because it's in the Portland metro area, it's part of the Oregon Conference of the Adventist Church, and it is still the largest or second, I think it's the largest church in the Oregon Conference and the second largest Adventist church in the Northwest, only beat out by the College Church in Walla Walla. And they were the first names on the church charter. They're often commemorated as the founders of that church and the founders of that school. It was built with their money on their land by them. And when that church had the 100th anniversary of the signing of its church charter, they asked for some family delegation to show up, and I ended up going as part of that. I was at that point a senior at Walla Walla College as a theology major, so I made the drive over, and more people showed up from the family than they were expecting. So I had to go into the overflow seating on the front pew as opposed to with the family, which meant I ended up sitting next to the conference vice president, who I'd had a job interview with a couple months before. And after that service was over, I got to pin him down and ask him why I didn't get a job offer when he all but guaranteed me one a few months before. And that was really fun, making him squirm.
Is that around the time you had a calling for the ministry?
Yeah. Yes. So My mom had Hodgkin's lymphoma when she was around 30, and she almost died from the cancer and treatment. Then eventually went into full remission. Oh, my daughter is
sounds
awake.
familiar. As we all predicted.
Yeah, Kylie, go with mommy.
Podcasts make kids cry. I understand.
Yep. So yeah, my mom had cancer. She was on the verge of death, like she had no immune system, and she prayed for strength to be able to take care of her family, and felt a sense of calm. And the next checkup she had, the cancer was gone. So she attributed that to a miracle, as opposed to the aggressive radiation and chemo, multiple rounds of each that she had. Yes, wiped out her immune system and made her feel like absolute shit, but also wiped out the cancer. It left her sterile, and then 2 years after she'd finished up with the cancer, she was pregnant. The Adventist Church at that time was pro-choice. They have since become pro-life and anti-choice. Softly anti-choice. They were softly pro-life before that. And she knew that if she'd told anybody that she was pregnant, that they would tell her to get an abortion. Her doctor, family, or in the church, everybody would have told her she needed to get an abortion. That would have not been safe. And when you look at the data available at that time, she should have gotten an abortion. If you look at the available data now, she should have done whatever the hell she wanted, because the data shows that wasn't actually that high risk. Yes, high risk, but not that high of risk. But she believed that pregnancy was a gift from God, so she kept it quiet until the second trimester, when she knew she couldn't hide it anymore, and that by that point, the pressure to get an abortion would go down. And then she had me, and I was healthy and normal, which surprised the doctors. They were expecting the pregnancy to not be successful, and if I had been born alive, they were expecting deformities, and were pretty surprised that I was perfectly healthy and normal. So then I grew up being told that I was a miracle, and believing that I was a miracle, that my life was a very direct gift from God, and that God had a special plan for me. And then I got to my senior year of high school at a Adventist boarding school that had been built in the 1950s with the thought that Jesus would return before the end of that decade. So they did really shoddy craftsmanship because they were expecting it to be a temporary construction with Jesus's return right around the corner. And
it's always like 5 minutes from now. It's going to happen during this podcast. I promise. Maybe a 300-minute podcast would help.
Yeah. And then, but Adventists at Adventist high schools, at least in the West, or at least in the Northwest, have a thing called senior survival. And I know not all Adventist schools do this, but it's at least a thing in the Northwest where they teach you how to go survive in the woods during the end days. And so all of the seniors, we all got onto the bus, and we went 5 miles from campus because we were in a remote of enough location that we only had to go 5 miles to get into like official wilderness area. We were that close. And so we got there, we set up our survival camp with tarps and improvised shelters. Excuse me. And it all started. Everything was fine. Then we got there Sunday. Nothing eventful happened Sunday. Nothing eventful happened Monday. And then Tuesday morning, we were in the middle of the spiritual survival class. And the pastor leading that class was leading us through a excerpt book from Ellen White, the Adventist Church's prophetess's book, The Great Controversy, that focused specifically just on the very end days. And we were reading a chapter that day about how easy it will be to be deceived in the end days. And then the principal shows up with a classmate who had been missed it up to that point because of a family wedding. And he'd just gotten back. And the principal called the pastor over, whispered something in his ear. And the pastor came back and said, "What if I told you terrorists took over an airplane and flew it into the World Trade Center? And then more terrorists took over another airplane and flew it into the World Trade Center? And then more took over another plane and flew it into the Pentagon. And more took over another one and are headed for the U.S. Capitol. What would you say?" We all said we wouldn't believe it. And then he said, "It happened." And none of us believed him. He spent the next 45 minutes or an hour trying to convince us that he wasn't lying to us. And then finally, the principal turned on the radio in his van, and we got to listen to the news. And it started to click for about the half of us that still didn't believe. Started to click that, no, this wasn't some lesson about how easy it will be to be deceived in the end days. This is something that feels very end days that actually happened. And then it went silent. And we continued through senior survival. We didn't leave until Friday. But we were right under the main air path through the west coast of the U.S. And by that afternoon, you could look up and there weren't any condensation trails. None. We kept looking up and there were none. On a normal clear day, you look up and you see at least one contrail at any given moment, because every plane flying up or down the west coast of the U.S. is flying right over that spot. And the skies were silent. They were quiet. It was empty. And we were all concerned that it was the end days. And like, I started flipping through Revelation, and I found a passage that said, with the opening of the seventh seal, that there was silence for half a minute, or not half a minute. There was silence for half an hour in heaven. And the Adventist Church has this principle of prophetic time is 1 day in prophecy equals 1 year in the real world. So day to a year principle. And I applied that to, well, what would silence in heaven, what would a half hour be? And it came out on the day to a year principle. A half hour is a week. All civilian aviation was grounded for 1 week. Thus, the seventh seal has been opened. We are in the very end days. And a few weeks later, I started feeling a sense of calling to the ministry. And I resisted that, thought that was nonsense, that was insane, and I kept feeling it. And then it kept coming back over and over again. And then I went on a mission trip to Mexico to build a church, and I got bit by a poisonous spider. And while I was recovering from an infected poisonous spider bite, I had a lot of time on my hands. Oh, I also had pneumonia. There was that too.
Yeah, I was like, come on, tell them everything. Come on.
Yeah, the pneumonia didn't get discovered until after I'd recovered from the spider bite infection. And then I'm at that last checkup with the doctor, and he's like, well, your toe's looking better. Doesn't look like I'm going to have to lob it off now. So, and I'm like, oh, I should probably tell you, I've had this cough off and on for the last, 2 or 3 months. And he had to listen to my lungs, and he's like, you have pneumonia. So he gave me a Z-Pack, and that resolves about a week later. But so I was super duper sick, and I spent, it was the end of my senior year. I wasn't taking that many classes, and I basically read the Bible 2 or 3 hours every day. And
so sorry.
Yeah, I was okay. This school is, I'm sure you've never heard of the town of Roseburg. Probably haven't heard of the city of Medford, but it's halfway between in Southern Oregon. Medford is where one of the places in Oregon that was on fire back in September. And so it's in the middle of those two. It's literally the nearest town that is an actual town is 20 miles away. The nearest city of more than 10,000 people is 40 miles away. The nearest city of more than 50,000 people is, just Medford, about 50 miles away. It's really out in the middle of nowhere. The only way on campus is over a single covered bridge. It is a seriously locked down place out in the middle of nowhere. And there's no TV there because there's too many mountains in the way. And internet access sucked because it was 2002 and we were in the middle of nowhere. We had 3 dial-up lines on campus. That was it for internet. And yeah, so all I did was, I did a lot of Bible reading, and I became convinced that God's special plan for me, the reason why my miraculous birth happened, was that I needed to help get the world ready for Jesus's return. And I prayed, asking God what to do, and heard in my head the answer, go to Walla Walla, take theology. So I did it.
Now, how does that sound like the voice as you heard at the time of God?
It sounded like it was me, but definitely not me. Like it sounded like my thoughts sound in my voice, but it didn't feel like it was my thought saying that. It felt disconnected from me, but sounded like me.
How do you think of it now? Like, do you think of it as a justification when you have a tough choice to make and then you're like, well, God wanted me to go this way?
I think of it now as I had a tough choice to make. I was in an apocalyptic death cult at a boarding school in the middle of nowhere, having just gone through an apocalyptic survival school. I was on 2.7 grams of antibiotics a day. I had a poisonous spider bite that was infected in my left big toe. I had pneumonia. I was super duper unhealthy. I know the night I almost died of the pneumonia. I was really, really sick and didn't know how sick I really was. I was not in my right mind. That's how I look at that now. Unfortunately, that mental pathway had been opened up. So for several years after that, I could pray and hear answers back.
I think you're hearing answers now with your daughter. Wake up. But what?
Yeah.
So, like, Is there any way to compare yourself to your forefathers who got taught the Bible and were like, oh, this is the way, versus you who studied the Bible and actually studied like some of the original languages of the Bible, and then it didn't stick? I mean, Jesus has to be really pissed. I mean, 400 episodes. Whew, I tell you, lightning is coming down.
It's one of the things that particular line of the family that has the strongest connection with the Adventist Church is a family of early adopters. They became Baptists in the 1600s, when the term at the time would have been Anabaptists. Like, they were radicals that both the Royalist and the Cromwell's Puritans would have wanted to kill. They were not in a popular religious position, and still weren't when they left England and came to the U.S., where being a Baptist in the U.S. in the 1860s would have been a much more comfortable position than Kent, England in the 1860s. But they couldn't be comfortable in a relatively mainstream religious position then. They had to branch out and be early adopters in the Adventist Church. Now, the Adventist Church wasn't established until officially incorporated until 1863. And my great-great-grandfather converted in the 1870s.
That's right.
That was early adoption. And I became an atheist in 2008. I come from a long line of apostates and people who don't like to stick with the party line.
And how did you end up? So you're in Idaho, or you close to Boise? Is that around right?
I live in Boise.
You're not super far from where the rest of your family is, right?
My grandparents ended up settling in far eastern Oregon, a couple miles across the border from Idaho. And sorry, I just heard my wife talking about being out of eggs, and yeah, we just ate the last of them this morning. Sorry, that distracted me. But yeah, just a couple miles away, and I was born at a hospital. No, I'm not going to scratch that. I was born 2 miles from the Idaho border, 50 miles from where I live now. And I grew up in southwestern Oregon, about 500 miles away from where I live now. But I, basically came back to where I'm from. But most of my family, like my grandparents' descendants, my cousins and the like, have scattered across the Northwest and beyond. So I've got a couple cousins within 20 or 30 miles, but like my parents are 500 miles away.
Well, how is, and I've been a little bit connected, but how is like the Boise, Idaho, like atheist community?
It's been, when I moved here, I got very active in the community, and this is a very common story. Single guy moves to town, is an atheist in what you think is a very Mormon area. And then you get involved in the atheist community and start to find out that, yes, there are a lot of Mormons here compared to, well, a lot of other places, but most people in Boise don't give a shit about religion. You get outside of Boise and people do care a lot, but in Boise, most people don't care. And I started to get involved in leadership with one group, and then ran another group, and then started dating my now wife, and then Coalition of Reason came through, and we formed a Coalition of Reason, and then I became the head of that, and we ran every parade and festival and event that we could. We had a presence. Those first couple years, we got mostly boos, and by the time we stopped doing them, we got mostly cheers. And then we just kind of stopped going to the events that are in bars, which a lot of the atheist community events here are in bars, and kind of went through the pretty typical thing of you meet somebody at the group and then you get married and then you stop going. The community is still alive and well, but we're not particularly involved in it anymore.
Well, I mean, that makes sense. Plus, going to bars seemed like like an event that was normal a year ago, and now it seems like most local groups that I'm aware of, they do Zoom meetings now instead of actually going to a location. But you get like over the need to like go to a place and meet with other atheists because you've met so many. But what happens when a cultural event like the Super Bowl happens, and then toward the end of that not so good Super Bowl, there's an ad for Jeep featuring Bruce Springsteen that has the American flag in a church? Like, how do you think about something like that? Because me watching it, I mean, pretty much alone, I was like, I don't know about this. I'm not so sure.
Well, I have a podcast event about it. I watched that. Yeah, I was angry about it. And then I bitched about it on the podcast. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then Bruce Springsteen got a DUI like last week, so that didn't help us. Was he in a Jeep? I doubt he was in a Jeep.
That DUI was just reported last week. It actually happened.
I had a feeling it probably was not like 2 days ago.
It was in November. He was driving in a national park in New Jersey under the influence. Yeah.
They don't do that.
No, especially
like,
you get in trouble.
Springsteen, you have so much money, but why is it in this era that we still feel the need to quote unquote meet in the middle? I don't even know what the middle is. Like a head that's halfway cut off. Like what is the middle? That like it's not a good place.
My fear on this is that Joe Biden is leading a push for unity, and I do think we all should be behind trying to unify the divides in our country, fix the racial divides, the political divides, the cultural divides, and improve the health and safety of the union. Unfortunately, we have one party that has been completely taken over by evangelical Christians, that it pushes for any lack of mention of religion as being inherently against religion. Heck, we've got Supreme Court rulings citing hostility towards religion. And so to not make Trump's prophecies that Biden is going to destroy Christianity true, Biden, who is a devout Catholic, is using a lot of language that comes naturally to him that I believe he is strategically using to try to reach moderate Republicans and independents, to bring them into the fold. And it's easier to bring them in than it would be to lose atheists.
Yeah, they're not so worried about atheists. like the inauguration speech, which I think many atheists have covered, was very religious-y
Yeah.
in talk. But truthfully, when it comes down to it, like Christians, the majority of them probably would agree more with atheists than they would agree with the people running the Republican Party. It's just that they speak the language of Jesus, which oddly can go any way. It's strange.
Yeah,
You could take the words of someone who was recorded by 4 different people, could be taken in many different ways. It's surprising that happened.
now what I saw from the Trump administration was horrific actions that were destroying secularism and destroying human rights, and it was being described in the most grotesque religious language. It was the use of religion in ways that I found infuriating as a curmudgeon to drive a particular agenda. Biden's use of religious language I find cringeworthy, not infuriating. He uses it, he means it. You can easily describe it as being metaphorical speech, but I don't like it. But his actions are all in the right direction, so there's that. That's a good thing, and actions matter more than words.
Yeah, we have to be over the fact of getting crazy about any God talk, because Catholicism, that could be a bunch of episodes about the very Trump-loving side of it, and then the fact that Catholicism was actually like, Roe v. Wade is good when it happened. Like, it's very, and there's also a pro kind of workers side to the Catholicism.
Mm-hmm.
So it definitely covers a lot of base. Every religious faction covers a lot of bases. I don't know if Seventh Day is still that way, because I don't know how big of a group it is as opposed to like the Mormons, because the Mormons, they own states. Seventh Day Adventists, not so much.
The Adventist Church owns countries.
Oh,
yeah.
big country.
The Mormon Church has a total of something like, what is around 10, maybe 12 million members worldwide, 3 million of whom are in the US. The Adventist Church has 20 million members, 1 million of whom are in the US.
So why is it that Mormonism gets so much attention then? Is it just you're really good at mission work as opposed to them?
The Mormon Church the Mormon Church owns a state. If you own a state, you have senators and you have representatives. You have and Mormons have, in the last 10, 15 years, thoroughly integrated themselves in with the Republican Party and become mainstream within that. There are more Mormons in Congress for sure than there are Adventists. Most people don't know that the chaplain of the U.S. Senate is an Adventist, and he's been the chaplain there for like the last 10 or 15 years. And there are Adventists in Congress, but they don't make a big deal about their religion like Mormons do. Mormons have also gotten a lot more attention because of Mitt Romney specifically.
Mm-hmm.
When he was the Republican nominee, that was the first time a Mormon was on the national ticket. And that was a big deal. That made evangelicals have to rethink how they feel about Mormons. Adventists, on the other hand, and Mormons have been doubling down on their being different as key to their identity, whereas Adventists have spent the last 70 years trying to blend in with the mainstream while worshiping on Saturday and not eating pork, and not drinking beer. or any alcohol. But Adventists have also, there was an Adventist running for president on the Republican side in 2016. There was a Republican candidate for the 2016 Republican ticket whose wife was Adventist. Ted Cruz's wife is an Adventist. Ben Carson is an Adventist, and but his religion wasn't a big deal. Unlike Mormons, their religion is a big deal. In part because they own Utah.
But not Idaho. It's just a lease to own situation.
They own Utah, and they have definite influence in Idaho, Arizona, and Nevada. But the real power, at least here in Idaho, is Catholics, Pentecostals, and evangelicals, not Mormons. Everybody just blames everything on the Mormons because evangelicals like to hate a lot of the same things that Mormons hate. And conservative Catholics also like to hate a lot of the same things that Mormons hate.
Yeah, there were a lot of billboards I remember seeing in Georgia when Mitt Romney was running pro like Mormonism, like, hey, no, we're not different. We're the same. We're fine. We're just a different, slightly different version of Christianity, which is like, yeah, but sure.
Whereas if Ben Carson had won the nomination in 2016, there probably would have been billboards about he's an Adventist, and Adventists aren't that weird.
Exactly.
But he didn't win, so it didn't matter.
It's true. He just had a cabinet spot.
Yeah.
The past
Nobody cares who cabinet secretaries are.
Yeah, it's true. So when you're, not taking care of a kid and not doing a podcast, do you have any hobbies that you can share?
Camping is the big one, and camping, computer stuff, and woodworking that is mostly at this point related to camping. We've got a pop-up camper that we got a really good deal on from some friends who decided they hated it and it was way too much work. And so I've been putting a lot of work the last couple of years in restoring this 1983 Jayco J-Flight pop-up camper. And it is so much fun to take that out into the woods. And which in Idaho, there are so many woods and mountains around to go camp in. And it's really nice. I had to rebuild the roof last year. And so that was a lot of work, but the woodworking skills I've developed over the last few years playing around with that helped make that possible. And this next year, I have a couple of things I need to fix on the roof and some cabinets to rebuild, and get to do more of that. And I am very much a open source software enthusiast, and have a home server and another system I'm about to spin up as a server. And all of my computers here all run Linux. And yeah, that's something that gives me joy, working on those.
Well, it's always
building
good
up systems that I can host myself.
It's always good to see, the outside of the podcast and atheist world, what the enthusiast level is. So how can people find Atheist Nomads and help celebrate episode 400 with you?
Go to atheistnomads.com. There will be a post there at atheistnomads.com/live for the live stream when that is better planned. And you can follow us on Twitter at Atheist Nomads. Do not go to the Facebook page. That will be getting shut down soon. But Twitter and the website are good places to go, or anywhere that you find podcasts.
The best podcast, people. Only the best. Well, thanks, Dustin, for being back on. I'm glad we're able to pull this off. It's been a while. I'm trying to reach back to people I haven't chatted with in a while. Like, hey, we have a community. I promise. But it was good to hear your stories again. I'm glad you're doing well.
All righty.